Hello everybody, how are you doing today? I hope you're keeping well and I hope your reading is going well. The Booker Prize Longlist for 2023 was recently announced, and today I would really love to walk you through it and give you my thoughts on the 13 novels that have been selected. I'm going to give you my opinion on what books I think may make the shortlist, and I'm also going to let you know my personal favourite from the selection. I've also asked members of the Hardcore Literature Book Club for their insights, their reaction to the Booker, because we truly have some extraordinarily sensitive and incredibly perceptive readers in this community, and there's been some really thought-provoking discussion that I would love to get into. Now, many readers are saying that the list feels a little bit different this year, and there are some very intriguing choices. Now, I follow the Booker every year. I love to see what makes it onto the long list. I love to make guesses as to what might make the shortlist, and I do also like to bet on who the winner might be. And we'll find that out soon enough. At time of recording, the shortlist will be announced next month, and the winner will be announced towards the end of the year. Now, I've said before that I've become a little bit disillusioned with prize lists like the Booker over the years, and even those who love the Booker and similar prizes have wondered about the judging criteria. Many have said that it seems rather inconsistent, and many have wondered whether the power of the writing itself is subservient to other criteria. Indeed, not only fans of the Booker, but those working in the book industry, working in publishing, working in bookshops, have pointed out that the list is rather commercialised, and have wondered whether it truly is literary merit that is being championed. Now, if you'll allow me a moment to indulge what could be a controversial opinion, although hearing from many readers it seems as though this actually is rather a common opinion. I would like to say, and I'm going to stress that this is completely detached from the current list. This is not an opinion that's based on the long list that's just been announced, but we'll get to that list in a moment. My problem is that I felt as though I was consistently confronted with books that used the excuse of being high on style to justify lacking substance and story and theme and wisdom and philosophy, and yet the style wasn't that good. The style wasn't good enough or ingenious enough to compensate for the lack of story. Ultimately, I became rather disillusioned with the prize lists because a lot of them, not all, and I do want to introduce that caveat, definitely not all, but a lot of them just seemed rather bland. They weren't saying anything interesting or hard-hitting or nuanced, and also what they were saying, or indeed not saying, wasn't being introduced in an entertaining or thought-provoking way. That was the biggest sin, if you like, in my opinion, with a lot of books that would make it to such prize lists. It was that they seemed very bland and forgettable, ultimately. Now, I love to focus on classic literature, but just because that's where I focus does not mean I do not read contemporary literature, because I'm always interested to see what's being written today. And here's the thing with the classics and a deep reading program that aims to take you through classic literature. There's a cognitive bias that occurs that could lead one to believe that there's no good or indeed great literature being written today and that it was all done in the past. Here's the thing, however. If you were thrown back to the 1860s or the 1920s, for example, just say you had a time machine and you went back to one of those decades. And I mention those decades because they are strong when it comes to the history of literature. The 1860s and the 1920s spawned some incredible works, really influential stuff, really hard-hitting and sublime stuff. If you could time travel back to those years and you popped into a bookstore, would every single book you were confronted with be genius? Would it be a masterpiece? The answer is absolutely not. How much in a single year would have been great, and how much would have been dispensable and throwaway and forgettable? A lot wouldn't be worth reading, but time has done the testing for us. The difficult thing when it comes to reading contemporary literature is that testing hasn't been done for us yet because time has not passed. And make no mistake, the great works of our time are being written now. We are today as readers most certainly in company with works that will be considered classics in the not too distant future. And so when it comes to extensively reading contemporary literature, you're hunting for diamonds, yeah? And that means you've got to wade through a lot of rough. You've got to wade through a lot of works that aren't diamonds. But I think that has to be the thrill. That has to be the fun of it for readers who focus on contemporary literature. It's very, very exciting to think that you could stumble across a work that later on in your lifetime, or indeed after your lifetime, will be considered a profound and influential masterpiece. That's very exciting. And there is an injustice that comes from juxtaposition. It can be rather unfair to juxtapose the best of the best from, say, the 19th century with a random book that came out earlier this year, a book that came out in 2018 or 2021, for example. That can be an unfair and unrealistic demand. But we might wonder, is there value in reading the books that are forgettable whilst you're hunting for the masterpieces, whilst you're hunting for your favourite book? I think it forces you to realise what you value. And I realise that ultimately I want story. Yeah, I pretty much always want story. I want characters, I want conflict, I want philosophy, and I want profundity. I want wisdom. And I think having substance can make a compelling excuse for lacking style, but not the other way around. I think being high on style without substance is ultimately something that's not worth reading. And I think whilst you're hunting for diamonds, the really special books are those works that marry substance and style together. But indeed, for me, not everything has to be literary. Ultimately, I want to be served up a good story, an unforgettable and resonant story. And ultimately, when I'm reading a book, I don't want my time wasted. I want the author to make me think, wow, that was time well spent. And I never question the time that I invest in the time-tested writers, the writers who have endured. I don't question Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or Virginia Woolf, Shakespeare, George Eliot, Jane Austen, or James Joyce. I don't question these writers. But speaking of diamonds, here's the thing. Despite my disillusionment, one looks over the history of, say, the Booker Prize, one looks down the list of winners, and one cannot deny that they absolutely have gotten it right rather frequently. Some of my personal all-time favourite books are prize winners. I'm currently rereading Jan Martel's Life of Pi, and I'm convinced. I've reread this book endlessly and it absolutely holds up, and it's definitely one of my favourites. Lincoln in the Bardo, that was a very good year for the Booker Prize. George Saunders's masterpiece. If you haven't read that already, I highly recommend it. Coetzee's Disgrace is another Booker Prize winner. That's another example where they got it right, and indeed this one is cited as a favourite from this year's Chair of Judges, Essie Adujan. There's Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. There's plenty of great examples. You can go down that list, you can even pick one at random and you'll probably have a good read. Now, I mentioned my disillusionment with the prize because indeed it feels as though there's been a bit of a different response to this year's list. The tone at the moment seems to be, yes, Booker don't always get it right, but this year they may have actually nailed it. That seems to be the tone at the moment. There's a lot of excitement around this list, and I can understand why. And indeed, looking at the list, I found myself getting rather excited this year too. Now, let's get into the list. The long list is comprised of 13 novels, referred to as the Booker Dozen. And this year, the 13 books were whittled down from 163 novels in a matter of just a few months, which is absolutely incredible. What a feat to read that many books in such a short time frame. The guiding ethos is that these books are written in English and published in the UK and Ireland between October of last year and September of this year. The list this year features books from 4 continents. There are 4 Irish writers, and that's interesting. A lot of people have commented on the representation of Irish writers this year. Ireland is certainly very proud of this. I might be a little bit biased, but I think that's absolutely brilliant to see. And there's been a lot of articles recently where people have been trying to work out why Ireland is so well represented. Well, aside from the fact that telling a good story is in the blood, there have been a lot of initiatives that have been very beneficial for creatives, for artists and writers in Ireland. Ireland recently launched a scheme to support artists and creatives with a basic income. I believe they're also exempt from paying income tax. So we have 4 Irish writers on the long list. We also have 10 authors that are being recognised by Booker for the first time, which is very interesting. I read an article recently on how to win the Booker. Is there a formula for winning the Booker? And one part of the formula, if you like, involves having an extensive career and a previous Booker listing. So the fact that the majority of the writers on the long list haven't had a previous Booker listing is quite interesting. And in the long list we also have 4 writers who are debut novelists. So very exciting stuff. Let's check out the judges. Now, I reckon you'll likely recognise many of these judges. We have James Shapiro on the judging panel, and those following along with the Shakespeare project at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We're reading all of Shakespeare, the complete works of Shakespeare, in a year. It is so fun. We've been splitting his aesthetic development, his career, into 4 phases, and this has been the most personally fulfilling reading project that I've conducted to date. And those following along have said that it's a very special reading project, and they have noticed a lot of self-growth and a lot of intellectual development. And not only is this project incredibly rewarding, but it's not as challenging as you might think. Those who've been following along with our Shakespeare readings will know that I've recommended Shapiro's work a lot. 1606, The Year of Lear, tremendous book. 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, fabulous stuff. Contested Will, Did Shakespeare Write Shakespeare? That's really good too, and many more. So Shapiro is one of my favourite Shakespeare scholars. And in the Booker Q&A, Shapiro has called the Booker the Mount Everest of literary prizes. Shapiro says he got into reading as a child around the age of 10, same age as me, and he gravitated to long works like The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Indeed, we're reading this at the moment in the book club, and it's been such an adventure. If you want to read this one with a great group, you can jump in and follow along at your own pace at any time. Shapiro says, reading over 150 works of fiction has increased my appreciation of how hard it is to write a good novel, let alone a great one. I thought it was also interesting to note that we have Robert Webb on the judging panel. He's one of my comedy heroes. Peep Show is one of my favourite shows of all time. Webb also has a theatre career. He played Wooster in Jeeves and Wooster. He's made documentaries. He's made a documentary on T.S. Eliot, and he's written memoir and recently debuted his own novel. He also writes newspaper columns, so he has an incredible career. The chair of the Booker Prize judges for 2023 is Essie Adujan. She is the internationally best-selling author of Washington Black, and her Booker Q&A is fantastic. She says, perhaps uniquely, the Booker jurists are not all fiction writers, but astute readers from across many fields, esteemed actors, scholars, poets, etc. This broadness of perspectives, along with the vast geographical reach of the submissions, give the prize its particular texture. You feel you are reading the best of world literature. We also have Mary Jean Chan, poet and lecturer of creative writing, who says, I love how the Booker gives significant weight and exposure to its long list and short list rather than simply celebrating the winning novel. The most important quality I am looking for in a long listed book concerns the way it is written. The prose must be exquisitely honed with a unique sense of verve and style that captivates the reader from start to finish. We also have Adjoa Ando on the panel, a renowned actor who's worked on television, radio and stage with a significant amount of Shakespeare with the RSC. Andoa says, I'm looking for a book that transports me. I'm interested in a quality that I find expands my mind and my heart in new and unexpected ways. Something that stays with me. I want to walk around with it and feel the vibration of that book with me out in the world. That seems like a pretty good thing to be searching for. And Doa goes on and says, and that book has no particular setting or genre or gender or race. For me, it's about the quality of the story and the sentences and the way they hook into my heart, into my imagination and my intellect. I want to be stimulated on all fronts. It could be a very tiny book, or it could be something enormous. I have no boundaries. It's about how it works on my intelligence, my spirit and my heart. Now let's get into the list. So we have Tan Twan Eng's The House of Doors. Tan Twan Eng is a Malaysian author and he's been listed before. He's won a few different literary prizes in his time, and indeed he was on the panel for the International Booker Prize this year. I think it's interesting that readers at the Hardcore Literature Book Club have expressed a preference for the International Booker, which I can personally completely understand. Tan Twan Eng says he likes well-constructed, well-written and unpretentious novels that don't waste the reader's time. Yeah, I'm with you there. He's spoken about abhorring censorship of any kind and discussing what he looks for as a judge, because he's a judge as well as a writer. He says, the weightier the themes a writer wants to explore, the stronger the story needs to be, because the story is the vehicle that has to carry his or her ideas from the first page to the last. I'm looking for luminous writing woven into a powerful story. Novels that appeal not only to the head, but to the heart. Novels that are not just clinging desperately by their fingertips to the latest and overcrowded fashionable bandwagon, but novels that will still speak to readers 2, 5, 20 years from now. I'm looking for novels that are not timely, but timeless. Sounds to me like a brilliant guiding ethos. So let's have a brief look at what this one's about. It's 1921, and at Cassowary House in the Straits Settlements of Penang, Robert Hamlin is a well-to-do lawyer, and his steely wife Leslie, a society hostess. Their lives are invigorated when Willie, an old friend of Robert's, comes to stay. Willie Somerset Maugham is one of the greatest writers of his day. Okay, so right off the bat, I'm wondering if one needs to know a lot about Somerset Maugham, if one has to have read a lot of his works. Is that a prerequisite? That's what I'm wondering as I go into this one. Personally, I've not read a lot of his works. We're told that Somerset Maugham is beleaguered by an unhappy marriage, ill health and business interests that have gone badly awry. He's also struggling to write. The more Leslie's friendship with Willie grows, the more clearly she sees him as he is, a man who has no choice but to mask his true self. As Willie prepares to leave and face his demons, Leslie confides secrets of her own, including how she came to know the charismatic Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary fighting to overthrow the imperial dynasty of China. And more scandalous still, she reveals her connection to the case of an Englishwoman charged with murder in the Kuala Lumpur courts. A tragedy drawn from fact and worthy of fiction. Now, let's look at another book that has made the list, and this is a favourite of mine. Indeed, this is my current personal favourite, and it is Paul Murray's The Bee Sting. Paul Murray was born in Dublin in 1975, and The Bee Sting is his fourth novel. This one's a bit of a whopper, clocking in at over 600 pages. It's the longest book on the long list. I must say this one absolutely sucked me in. It's one of those stories that I want to have told to me, so I've been enjoying the audiobook. Beautifully narrated by Heather O'Sullivan. Here's the story. Dickie's once lucrative car business is going under, but rather than face the music, he's spending his days in the woods, building an apocalypse-proof bunker. His exasperated wife, Imelda, is selling off her jewellery on eBay, while half-heartedly dodging the attentions of fast-talking cattle farmer Big Mike. Meanwhile, teenage daughter Cass, formerly top of her class, seems determined to binge drink her way to her final exams. And 12-year-old PJ, in debt to local sociopath Ears Moran, is putting the final touches to his grand plan to run away. Yes, in Paul Murray's brilliant tragicomic saga, the Barnes family is definitely in trouble. So where did it all go wrong? And if the story has already been written, is there still time to find a happy ending? Here's what Anthony Cummins in The Guardian says about this novel. The novel's energy comes from the steady crackle of dramatic irony, generated by what characters don't know about one another. Murray skillfully conceals his hand regarding a host of buried secrets and reframing narrative twists without seeming coy or turning the novel into a guessing game. He has a knack, too, for rescuing his characters from the brink of disaster, only to tip them agonisingly deeper into peril, fuelled by a potent combination of bad luck and dire decisions. It can't be overstated how purely pleasurable The Bee Sting is to read. Murray's observational gifts and A-game phrase-making render almost every page, every line it sometimes seems, a buzz, with fresh and funny insights, but always in the service of advancing the story. Key to the book's success is the breadth of generational experience that Murray's imagination seems so smoothly to inhabit. So that's The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. Let's look at the next one. We have Western Lane by Chetna Maru, who was born in Kenya and now lives in London. Chetna Maru has been published by the Paris Review, and she was an accountant before becoming a writer, and I absolutely love that. This is her debut novel. 11-year-old Gopi has been playing squash since she was old enough to hold a racket. When her mother dies, her father enlists her in a quietly brutal training regimen, and the game becomes her world. Slowly, she grows apart from her sisters. Her life is reduced to the sport, guided by its rhythms, the serve, the volley, the drive, the shot, and its echo. But on the court, she is not alone. She is with her pa. She is with Ged, a 13-year-old boy with his own formidable talent. She is with the players who have come before her. She is in awe. That's a very intriguing hook, isn't it? And I've read the first few pages and I'm liking what I've read so far. Next up, we have In Ascension by Martin MacInnes. MacInnes is a Scottish author, and this is a work that excites me a lot. We're told that this is a work that explores the natural world with wonder and reverence. This compassionate, deeply inquisitive epic reaches outward to confront the great questions of existence while looking inward to illuminate the human heart. Lee grew up in Rotterdam, drawn to the waterfront as an escape from her unhappy home life. Enchanted by the undersea world of her childhood, she excels in marine biology, travelling the globe to study ancient organisms. When a trench is discovered in the Atlantic Ocean, Lee joins the exploration team, hoping to find evidence of Earth's first life forms. What she instead finds calls into question everything we know about our own beginnings and leaves her facing an impossible choice: to remain with her family or to embark on a journey across the breadth of the cosmos. That sounds good, right? Let's go on to the next one. We have another Irish novelist, Paul Lynch's Prophet Song. This is perhaps also a good time to introduce another issue that I have with the Booker. This is something that I come across every single year. It's got nothing to do with the book itself or the story or the writer. It's the fact that I couldn't get hold of this one. One might say that I need to up my ARC game. Yeah, I need to get on those advanced reading copies. But this is something that I notice every single year. Is you get the long list, you get really excited, and there's at least 3, maybe 4 books that you simply cannot order. Yeah, the publication date is set far in the future, and this is something I don't really understand. If I was on the long list as an author, I would be going crazy that people weren't able to get my book easily. Make it super easy, because once that long list goes out, people want to read the books, right? And so with these books, a lot of the early reviews are from people who got an advanced reading copy, of course. That's just a little publishing pet peeve, but the book itself looks great. Paul Lynch has written 5 novels already and has won a healthy amount of prizes. This one is about a mother facing a terrible choice. On a dark, wet evening in Dublin, scientist and mother of 4, Eilish Stack, answers her front door to find the GNSB on her doorstep. 2 officers from Ireland's newly formed secret police want to speak with her husband. Things are falling apart. Ireland is in the grip of a government that is taking a turn towards tyranny, and as the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, Eilish finds herself caught within the nightmare logic of a collapsing society. Assailed by unpredictable forces beyond her control and forced to do whatever it takes to keep her family together. Very intriguing stuff. Okay, our next book is from Victoria Lloyd Barlow, and it's called All the Little Bird Hearts. Victoria Lloyd Barlow is an autistic writer, and she explores autism in this work. She also explores motherhood. I'm interested in this one. We're told that this is a lyrical and poignant debut novel that offers a deft exploration of motherhood, vulnerability, and the complexity of human relationships. Sunday Forrester does things more carefully than most people. On quiet days, she must eat only white foods. Her etiquette handbook guides her through confusing social situations, and to escape, she turns to her treasury of Sicilian folklore. The one thing very much out of her control is Dolly, her clever, headstrong daughter, now on the cusp of leaving home. Into this carefully ordered world step Vita and Rollo, a charming couple who move in next door and proceed to deliciously break just about every rule in Sunday's book. Soon they are in and out of each other's homes, and Sunday feels loved and accepted as never before. But beneath Vita and Rollo's polish lies something else, something darker. For Sunday has precisely what Vita has always wanted for herself, a daughter of her own. Next up we have Pearl by Sian Hughes, inspired by one of my favourite medieval poems called Pearl. We're told that Sian Hughes contemplates both the power and the fragility of the human mind in her haunting debut novel, which was inspired by the medieval poem of the same name. Marianne is 8 years old when her mother goes missing. Left behind with her baby brother and grieving father in a ramshackle house on the edge of a small village, she clings to the fragmented memories of her mother's love. The smell of fresh herbs, the games they played, and the songs and stories of her childhood. As time passes, Marianne struggles to adjust, fixated on her mother's disappearance and the secrets she's sure her father is keeping from her. Discovering a medieval poem called Pearl and trusting in its promise of consolation, Marianne sets out to make a visual illustration of it, a task that she returns to over and over but somehow never manages to complete. Tormented by an unmarked gravestone in an abandoned chapel and the tidal pull of the river, her childhood home begins to crumble as the past leads her down a path of self-destruction. But can art heal Marianne? And will her own future as a mother help her find peace? Next up we have a book called This Other Eden by Paul Harding. This is another one that I'm personally intrigued about. Full of lyricism and power, Paul Harding's spellbinding novel celebrates the hopes, dreams and resilience of those deemed not fit in a world brutally intolerant of difference. Inspired by historical events, This Other Eden tells the story of Apple Island, an enclave off the coast of the United States where castaways, in flight from society and its judgment, have landed and built a home. In 1792, formerly enslaved Benjamin Honey arrives on the island with his Irish wife, Patience, to make a life together there. More than a century later, the Honey's descendants remain alongside an eccentric, diverse band of neighbours. Then comes the intrusion of civilization. Officials determined to cleanse the island. A missionary schoolteacher selects one light-skinned boy to save. The rest will succumb to the authorities, institutions, or cast themselves on the waters in a new Noah's Ark. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Here's a book review from The Guardian again. Harding's novels are rife with carefully calibrated moments, when a character briefly transcends their desires and deficiencies, when a sentence lays them bare as hauntingly human. This reviewer says, "I can't help thinking that Harding's gifts have found their fullest expression in This Other Eden. Pick any excerpt from these 200 pages and you will find that each sentence contains multitudes and works well by itself, and yet the chapters, the paragraphs, have also been sewn together into a numinous whole." Next up, we have How to Build a Boat by Elaine Feeney. This one is written with tenderness and verve, and Elaine Feeney tells the story of how one boy on a unique mission transforms the lives of his teachers and brings together a community. Jamie O'Neill loves the colour red. He also loves tall trees, patterns, rain that comes with wind, the curvature of many objects, books with dust jackets, cats, rivers and Edgar Allan Poe. At the age of 13, there are two things he especially wants in life: to build a perpetual motion machine and to connect with his mother Noel, who died when he was born. In his mind, these things are intimately linked. And at his new school, when all else is disorienting and overwhelming, he finds two people who might just be able to help him. Elaine Feeney is another Irish writer, and she's previously won the Irish Novel of the Year award. She's also published a few collections of poetry and lectures at the National University of Ireland in Galway. Next up, we have If I Survive You by Jonathan Escoffery. And this is another one that I'm personally intrigued about, and this is another one that pulled me in. Again, I've only read the first few pages, but so far I like it. It grabs you immediately with the direct address. It begins by delivering the narrative in the second person, so you. We're told this is an exhilarating novel in stories that pulses with style, heart and barbed humour, while unravelling what it means to carve out an existence between cultures, homes and paychecks. In 1979, as political violence consumes their native Kingston, Topper and Sanya flee to Miami. But they soon learn that the welcome in America will be far from warm. Trelawney, their youngest son, comes of age in a society that regards him with suspicion and confusion. Their eldest son Delano's longing for a better future for his own children is equalled only by his recklessness in trying to secure it. As both brothers navigate the obstacles littered in their path, an unreliable father, racism, a financial crisis and Hurricane Andrew, they find themselves pitted against one another. Will their rivalry be the thing that finally tears their family apart? And next we have Sarah Bernstein's Study for Obedience. This is Sarah Bernstein's second novel, in which she explores themes of prejudice, abuse and guilt through the eyes of a singularly unreliable narrator. A young woman moves from the place of her birth to the remote northern country of her forebears to be housekeeper to her brother, whose wife has recently left him. Soon after her arrival, a series of inexplicable events occur. Collective bovine hysteria, the demise of a ewe and her newly born lamb, a local dog's phantom pregnancy, a potato blight. She notices that the local suspicion about incomers in general seems to be directed with some intensity at her, and she senses a mounting threat that lies just beyond the garden gate. And as she feels the hostility growing, pressing at the edges of her brother's property, she fears that, should the rumblings in the town gather themselves into a more defined shape, who knew what might happen, what one might be capable of doing. Then we have one that I've heard a lot of excitement about, and this is Sebastian Barry's Old God's Time. And I've read a fair whack of this myself already. In his beautiful, haunting novel, in which nothing is quite what it seems, Sebastian Barry explores what we live through, what we live with, and what may survive us. Recently retired policeman Tom Kettle is settling into the quiet of his new home, a lean-to annexed to a Victorian castle overlooking the Irish Sea. For months he has barely seen a soul, catching only glimpses of his eccentric landlord and a nervous young mother who has recently moved in next door. Occasionally, fond memories return of his family, his beloved wife June and their 2 children. But when 2 former colleagues turn up at his door with questions about a decades-old case, one which Tom never quite came to terms with, he finds himself pulled into the darkest currents of his past. So that sounds like an interesting one from the laureate of Irish literature. And we also have A Spell of Good Things by Ayobami Adebayo. And this is one that pulled me in as well. I found this one quite intriguing and I had to keep reading it. So I've read a fair whack of this and I'll continue reading this. This is a dazzling story of modern Nigeria and 2 families caught in the riptides of wealth, power, romantic obsession and political corruption. Eniola is tall for his age, a boy who looks like a man. His father has lost his job, so Eniola spends his days running errands for the local tailor, collecting newspapers and begging, dreaming of a big future. Wuraola is a golden girl, the perfect child of a wealthy family. Now an exhausted young doctor in her first year of practice, she's beloved by Kunle, the volatile son of family friends. When a local politician takes an interest in Eniola and sudden violence shatters a family party, Wuraola and Eniola's lives become intertwined. In this breathtaking novel, Ayobami Adebayo shines her light on Nigeria, on the gaping divide between the haves and the have-nots, and the shared humanity that lives in between. Now, what books do I think are going to make the shortlist? These are just tentative thoughts, and ultimately these are just the books that, at this early stage, have intrigued me, piqued my curiosity or pulled me in. I think If I Survive You could definitely make the shortlist. I think In Ascension is very likely to be there. This Other Eden I think could be on the shortlist. A Spell of Good Things could make it. Old God's Time I think could also make it. I also think Western Lane could make the shortlist, and I think The Bee Sting should be on the shortlist. Now I know that's 7 books, not 6, and there are going to be 6 on the shortlist, but I haven't fully made my mind up just yet. What I would like to see, and this is based on my early impression, I would like to see The Bee Sting definitely make it to the shortlist, and so far that's my personal favourite. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the winner, of course, but that's the one that I'm most excited about. But I'll definitely be exploring all of the works on the long list a little more, because indeed it's still early days. A little bit too early to make up our minds fully. Now let's see what other readers have said about the Booker this year and the prize generally. I asked members at the Hardcore Literature Book Club what they made of this year's announcement and the prize generally. George says that last year, before joining the book club, I read all 13 books off the long list and I enjoyed it a lot. That's a really impressive thing to do. I was trying to make my own shortlist before the shortlist was announced, but didn't finish in time, but managed to avoid the shortlist until I was done. That's a really fun project. I always want to do something like that each year, but making it through all 13 books on the long list, that's really impressive. I know a lot of readers will wait specifically for the shortlist because it whittles it down a little bit, doesn't it? But there is so much fun to be had when it comes to guessing what's going to make it and what's going to win. I'm personally thinking about the Nobel Prize for Literature a lot at the moment, and I'll be making my predictions on that in another video. George says, I enjoyed reading a bunch of things I would have otherwise never been exposed to, but in the end, most of these books can't hold a candle to the books we've been reading here this year. Well, we've been reading absolutely some of the greatest books ever written. We kicked off the year reading Tolstoy's War and Peace, then we moved on to Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. Now, a lot of readers really adored War and Peace, and then it was quite a shift into The Brothers Karamazov, and that was a rather painful book for many readers, but it's one that affords a lot of self-growth, and it's one that I think about pretty much every single day. We also read Virginia Woolf's Orlando, which was another gear shift, and that was a modern masterpiece. That was a beautiful work. That was high aestheticism right there. We've read some good plays as well with the book club. We recently read Oscar Wilde, The Importance of Being Earnest. We've read Henrik Ibsen, Aeschylus. Later this year we're going to read Goethe's Faust. George goes on to say, I just did a quick count and I've read 9 of the winners, and some of them are definitely powerful books, including Disgrace, which I just finished a few days ago. If I had more free time, I'd read all of the long list again for fun, but I'd rather keep up with our reading here in the book club. For what it's worth, my pick for the winner was the winner last year, The Seven Moons of Marley Almeida. Very nice. I'll have to see if it holds up to a reread. My least favourite book was Glory, and it made it to the shortlist last year. Fantastic stuff. Now, talking about predictions for this year, Sharon says, I will go out on a limb because my guess is as good as anyone's and say that The House of Doors by Tan Twan Eng will win this year. Now, I've heard a few readers say this. There's been a lot of excitement for this one. Eng's second novel, Sharon says, The Garden of Evening Mists, was shortlisted for the 2011 Man Booker Prize. Perhaps 2023 will be his year. This novel is based on W. Somerset Maugham's 1921 visit to Penang to visit friends. As one reader described the writing, the author's descriptions of Penang are stunning, making the landscape almost a character in itself. I do have a real soft spot for good descriptions of landscapes. I love vivid descriptions of locales. I also love descriptions of weather as well. But if a writer can make a locale into a character itself, I think that's a real accomplishment. I love that sort of thing. Sharon goes on to say, unfortunately, I cannot read this novel now because I'm reading Moby Dick alongside Blood Meridian. These are 2 works that we have extensive deep dive lectures on at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, both favourite books of mine, and they both make really complementary reads. I've spoken about this elsewhere, but reading Moby Dick and then following on with Blood Meridian makes for a very powerful reading experience. It's worth doing. Sharon says, but it's high up on my TBR list. I keep knocking one down to place another book at the top. Oh, and the UK cover, as shown on the Booker website, is superior to the US cover by a mile. Well, that's true, it is a gorgeous cover. The inside with its floral design is beautiful too. Vicky says, I always follow the Booker. I usually try and read the shortlist, but not sure I'll manage that with our reading schedule this year. Yeah, we're chock-a-block with great books this year. We're currently on The Count of Monte Cristo, and very, very soon we're going to have our how to read for Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. This is going to be a really profound reading experience, and once we get towards the end of Invisible Man, we'll start layering in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. We'll also very soon be embarking upon a deep reading of John Milton's Paradise Lost, and we're carrying on with Shakespeare. Later in the year we've got Gravity's Rainbow, we've got some Charles Dickens, so we've got plenty to keep us occupied. Vicky says, I haven't read a single thing on the long list this year, which is unusual for me. Martin MacInnes was a bookseller in our local Waterstones for years and knows my brother-in-law from work. That's incredible. I used to like him because he always wanted to chat about what you were reading and tell you about his writing. Nice, quiet, gentle chap. Yeah, I think it comes through in his writing from what I've read so far. I can definitely imagine that he's a nice bloke. Rachel says, I've always perused the Booker, and here in Canada, some of our top awards. I found that it introduces me to authors and books that I may have never picked up. Last year, I read Trust and The Colony from the Booker. The Colony was amazing. Trust was good. Intriguing story woven within a story. Governor's General Award in Canada has had an amazing roster of winners. Five Little Indians from 2020 was an absolute amazing read. I do find the book awards are a mixed bag. I do check out the books, but don't automatically read them. I have In Memoriam and In Ascension to read from this year. Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the values with these prize lists is they really do introduce you to books that you might not have picked up yourself, and there can be a lot of value in that. Sometimes we can get comfortable with our book choices, can't we? So having a curated list for us is incredibly valuable. But I also agree that it is very typically a mixed bag. Of course, we might say that that's one of the exciting elements of reading through such lists. Nafeel has also said something similar. I find most literary prizes a mixed bag. I generally peek to see what's listed at the major prizes, but rarely make an effort to read titles just because they make it to either the long or short lists. That's true of the Booker. I have to admit, most of what's on this year's long list isn't on my radar at all. I'll take a deeper dive when I have a moment, check out the descriptions and see if I want to add any to my TBR pile, but I'm also in the too much to read camp at the moment, not even keeping up with book club reads, so I doubt I'll tackle much of the Booker list. I completely relate to that. Selectivity is important, curating for oneself, not having a never-ending TBR, that's really important. I used to have a never-ending TBR. I was always adding things to my TBR, and I noticed that a lot of the time if I was adding a book to my TBR, it didn't necessarily mean that I was ever going to read it. It didn't mean that I was actually even interested in it. I was adding books because I thought I had to. And it was when I nixed the TBR list and I kept a roster, a very small roster of books, or I decided to embark upon just half a dozen masterpieces in a year. That's when my self-growth took a leap forward, and that's when I started to really adore my reading program and really love it all over again. Nafeel says, the one prize I do tend to make some effort with is the Women's Prize for Fiction. As most years I already have read or plan to read a few books that they choose for the long list. I find my taste often aligns with much of what they nominate. I'm afraid I haven't read much of this year's list yet, long or short, though I have a stack of a fair few of them on my coffee table. I'll get to them eventually. Elizabeth has said that she's attracted to the books by the Irish writers on the list. Did you all know, by the way, that in terms of the relative population size of the country, far more Irish writers than those of any other nation have been nominated for the Booker? I've already bought the Sebastian Barry and Paul Feeney books, which are sitting on my desk beside me now. It's a good year to be Irish for Booker fans. Now let's talk disillusionment, because a lot of readers have said that, like me, they've felt disillusioned with such prize lists over the years. Caroline says, I was always an avid follower of the Booker Prize, but for a long time I've been very disillusioned with it. I felt the prize was always solely about strength of writing and the power of the novel, but I feel more and more that this has become almost secondary. I don't want to be negative, but when the prize went to two authors a while back, and one of those seemed to be given the prize not in recognition for a masterful piece of writing, but more a sort of lifetime achievement, I turned my back on the prize. I was also a bit perplexed when a very strong book didn't get shortlisted for what appeared to be factors relating to the author, not the book. I'm not saying that no good books are on the list. I definitely don't mean that. But I have just lost faith that the book and the writing are the most important factors. This may be unjustified. However, I feel differently about the International Booker and end up finding new and very exciting writers in that arm of the Booker. Emma has said a very similar thing. She says, I used to read the books on the shortlist, but was disappointed by their quality. So nowadays I tend to completely ignore the Booker list. I currently work at a book agency, although I myself am not a book agent, and I've recently come to realise what a corporate machine the publishing industry is. It feels to me like the Booker is purely commercial. Just another way for agents and publishers to boost the sales of the books that they represent. I know it sounds cynical, but literary merit doesn't seem to play much a role. No, this doesn't sound cynical to me. Indeed, I remember when I found out that those little stickers you find on the covers of books when you go in the entrance of your favourite big chain bookstore, the staff picks stickers. This is Jonathan's favourite book. This is Katie's book of the month, that sort of thing. I discovered that these weren't actually staff picks, and these were a product of the publishing industry's commercial machine that you're talking about, Emma. Now, Misha has also expressed disillusionment with the list, and the way he's phrased it has really tickled me. I think you've completely nailed this, Misha. He says, "Oh, the Booker list has burned me so many times. But every year I go back, like an old, bad boyfriend." Yeah. This year I'm tentatively intrigued by the House of Doors and Study for Obedience, the latter depending on how brutal the animal stuff is. The winners have been much kinder to me, so there's hope, right? Shy hope. I love that description of going back to an old bad boyfriend. And we have a great comment from Hazel, who says, "I attempted to read the long list last year before joining the Hardcore Literature Book Club. I remember wanting a meaningful reading experience with the added excitement of trying to get through the long list before the short list was announced. Didn't quite work out that way. Yeah, that's the same case with me. I managed to get through maybe 8. Wow, that's good going, 8. Some were not yet available, some did not grab my attention at all, and once the shortlist was announced, I completely lost interest in picking up whatever wasn't on it. Then before long, the winner was announced, and in the end, I felt like I read a bunch of losers. I know that's not the case, but this year, I'm not racing to read any of them. It feels a bit forced and manufactured. I did find the long list announcement quite exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing who survives to the next round. Yeah, whatever we think about the institution, the commercial aspect, whether it's manufactured, and I would agree it does seem to be manufactured, the list itself, there's always something exciting about a list, isn't there? This one seems to be a little bit different this year, but then many readers have also wondered whether that's also been manufactured, whether they've deliberately done that because they know the reputation that the lists sometimes have. At some point, Hazel says, I might pick up a couple, The House of Doors, In Ascension, or maybe Old God's Time. Not now though. I thought about picking up those 3, but I know at this point they just end up on a forgotten pile somewhere. If something truly grabs my heart, I will pick it up. Hasn't happened yet though. Yeah, it would be interesting to know what the criteria is for judging. I think the judges did a very good job this year with outlining what they're looking for. They're looking for style, they're looking for theme, they're looking for something to grab them. Maybe that's a subjective element of literary appreciation, is you can't quite put your finger on what you're looking for. But then many readers cannot help but think, is there a list of things that they definitely want to have in? And looking at the list this year, it's very, very exciting, but there seems to be a lot of thematic overlap. And I've seen quite a few reviewers notice that it's actually rather apolitical this year. And in previous years, the list has come under a little bit of scorn for being a little bit political. This year it doesn't seem to be the case. But thematically, many of them seem to share the same qualities. And you do notice this when you have a pile of them beside you and you read them back to back. Maybe that's the writers picking up on something that's in the air. And we've got a great comment from Pierre, who says, I don't pay much attention to the Booker Prize, mostly because there are so many classics that I haven't read, and I prefer to read those first. I completely understand that. I'm so happy when I find a really exciting contemporary read, but when I'm reading contemporary stuff that just doesn't really do it for me, I start looking longingly over at my classics shelf. I start looking at all my old favourites and at the ones I haven't read yet. And I find myself tempted to stray, that's for sure. Pierre says, posterity is the most accurate prize in the end, at least for the readers. Many books won prizes and were forgotten a generation later. That's a really good point. It can be very interesting to look at those books that were esteemed even 100 years ago. A lot of them aren't the books we study and revere and respect and adore today. We've said that prize lists do sometimes get it right, but indeed it's very true that a lot of them just don't hold up. I thought this was interesting with the Nobel Prize. If you go back towards the beginning of the Nobel, firstly, the writers who don't get it are a conspicuous absence, and then there are a lot of writers that simply we don't know, and if you try to read them, firstly, if you can even get hold of them, they just don't hold up to a lot of the ones that have a strong reputation today. There are some exceptions, however, says Pierre. Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day and Jan Martel's Life of Pi come to mind. I'm also very curious about George Saunders's Lincoln in the Bardo, highly recommended, and Eleanor Catton's The Luminaries, Hilary Mantel's The Cromwell Trilogy, yeah, good stuff, as well as many of the older winners. We have a comment from River who says, I love to check out the Booker Prize list as well as the Pulitzer and the Nobel Prize winners. I've read several of the Bookers and used to make a point of reading every Pulitzer and Nobel winner in fiction. I used to follow a literary diet, a reading diet, that I affectionately called Pulitzers and Pulp, where I would make a point of reading the Pulitzer winners and also giving myself a healthy handful of the books that aren't going to win any prizes, but I just loved them. I say I used to read these, River says, because there's so many other books out there as well as the classics that I still want to read. I've not read any from this year's list, but I have read one of the authors, Sebastian Barry. His novel A Long, Long Way very often comes up in my thoughts, especially at Christmas. His scenes were perfectly haunting and somehow stayed glued to one's senses. I may check his book out at some point. And Barbara says that she tries to read the Pulitzer winner every year, and I will look at a book that I might otherwise pass on if it has won the Booker Prize, but I don't seek out the books right now. I'm enjoying the books so much in the book club that I haven't taken the time to read much else. I haven't even read Demon Copperhead yet by Barbara Kingsolver. She's one of my favourite authors, and this book won the Pulitzer. And we've got a great comment from Tatiana, who says, people are commenting that what we read here in the book club is far superior to the Bookers. Well, of course, we are reading the greatest books of all time. The only prize equal to what we read here is the Nobel. But I do like to keep up with the contemporary greats. Fosse and Murnane and Coetzee par exemple. And we will end the hardcore year fairly close to contemporary times with Pynchon. Oh yes, Gravity's Rainbow is going to be good fun. Pierre says Ben is basically the only source I trust to add contemporary books to my immediate to-read list right now. I'm looking forward to Invisible Man and The Pynchon. Well, thank you very much, Pierre. I really appreciate that. Regarding the Nobel, Pierre says, I think literary awards for lifetime achievement tend to be more deserving. Yeah, I'd agree with that. But sometimes even the Nobel is hit or miss. They gave it to Bob Dylan and not to Tolstoy. Lol. And James Joyce and Marcel Proust, etc. That's a really good point. Goodness, I remember when Bob Dylan won the Nobel back in 2016. That sparked some debate, didn't it? Even today, I get texts from a very good friend of mine who laments that Leonard Cohen didn't get the Nobel. So the discussion is still ongoing, and a lot of the discussion is around what constitutes literature. I remember at the time there were a lot of people who thought that the Nobel Committee either wanted to seem hip and cool or they just wanted to meet their favourite musician. I love Bob Dylan. But it was an interesting choice to throw in there with recent winners like Svetlana Alexievich and Alice Munro. And of course Kazuo Ishiguro. I'm rereading his Clara and the Sun in anticipation for a podcast. And I'm actually liking that book more this time around. I didn't like it as much the first time, but now I'm getting quite a lot out of it. Jane has made a prediction of 4 books that she thinks will make it into the shortlist, and she's starting with The House of Doors, Old God's Time, This Other Eden, and The Bee Sting. Cool, so we have an overlap of 3 books in our shortlist. Do you know, maybe all right with the House of Doors. I think that might very well make it into the shortlist. There seems to be a lot of excitement around this one. We've got a great comment here from Ellen, who says, it's wild that I'm totally unfamiliar with the books on the list this year. I always followed the shortlist as well as the Nobel and Pulitzer lists. The old me used to read everything at a furious pace, and the post-hardcore literature book club me has ignored most contemporary works since joining the club in January of 2022. It's been very liberating to walk into a bookstore and no longer feel the need to check off all the new titles I've read or need to read. I'd like to read the winning book if I have time. And Ellen says that she's just popping in to marvel at how I've changed my reading approach. I'm happy to let the urge for contemporary works creep in when the time is right, and will be enjoying my classics until then. That's fantastic. I think that's a good idea. Read the winner, because then the selection's been done for you. Especially when you have a very full-on, immersive and rewarding reading program where you're tackling great classic literature, then you've got to be really ultra selective about what you add and what you layer in. There seems to be a really wonderful commonality that I've noticed with readers joining the Hardcore Literature Book Club. There's a gear shift that happens that's very, very familiar to me. I remember my own gear shift going from quantity as my metric of success, my way of measuring if I was reading well enough, to quality. It is absolutely liberating and freeing to assure yourself that you don't need to read everything, that you're not missing out, and cultivate an intensely premeditated reading program that you're excited about, and each book gives you something different. I think focusing on quality and cutting down the amount of books you expect from yourself over the course of the year is great, because one, you can spend longer with each book, so you can really live it, you can live in the world, you can meet the characters, you can take their concerns on as your own, you can reread it, you can soak it in, you can memorize bits, you can discuss it with others, you really can make a meal out of each and every book. Now, I've said before that I used to read hundreds of books a year, and by the end of the year I didn't really remember any of them, because if you think about it, you're taking a couple of days to read a book and then on to the next. So if that's the way one is inhaling this literature, then you can't be that fussed about any one book. Now, obviously, some people read very, very fast. Some people have photographic memories. That's not me personally. I'm naturally very, very slow. And it would really stress me out and overwhelm me and fill me with anxiety, which would inevitably lead to a book slump where I didn't want to read anything when I felt like I had to keep up. Do you know what I mean? It is absolutely liberating to have a handful of books that you're really excited about, that you can really get to know, that you don't just glide over. That really is so wonderful. And funnily enough, it ends up making you more well-read. If you slow down and read less, you become more well-read in a much quicker time frame. And there are so many more great comments in this book club reading thread. So thank you so much to book club members who've kicked off this thoughtful conversation, and thank you so much for watching today. Thank you for going through the Booker long list with me. Let us know. Did any of the books that we looked at today pique your curiosity? Did they interest you? Which ones do you think will make the shortlist? Which ones are you personally most interested in? And let us know what you think of prize lists. What's been your experience in the past, not only with the Booker, but with prize lists generally? And I'd just like to end by saying that if you enjoy these bookish chats and you would like to deep read some classic literature with a great group, and you're not already a member of the Hardcore Literature Book Club, then please navigate over to patreon.com/hardcore literature, and you'll be warmly welcomed into a thriving, loving, and incredibly open community of lovers of literature. This year we've explored the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, we've explored Leo Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Virginia Woolf, the short stories of Alice Munro. We've read a ton of Shakespeare and we're going to continue to do so. We've read some fantastic plays. We have a play of the season. At time of recording, we're currently reading through Alexander Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo, and this is a riveting, rip-roaring read. And our next big read is going to be Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. We're then going to read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and we're going to have an epic poetry appreciation series where we break open John Milton's Paradise Lost. Later in the year, we're going to be reading Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. We have our secret Dickens. In addition to A Christmas Carol, which we reread every year around Christmas time, we have already enjoyed two of Dickens's works, Great Expectations and The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and later this year we will unveil what the secret Dickens for the year is, and it's a really good one. We also have an extensive back catalogue of lectures and bookish discussions on works like George Eliot's Middlemarch, Jane Austen's Persuasion, Moby Dick, Don Quixote, Les Miserables, Frankenstein, Dracula, James Joyce's Ulysses, and many, many more. So that's at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Thank you so much again for watching today. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you. I'm grateful for you. And I hope you have a lovely day. Happy reading, everybody, and bye-bye for now.